Thanks for the awesome introduction. So glad that you guys all made it to hear a little bit about build infrastructure. My name is Shawn. I used to be an engineer. Right now I've been working with MacStadium for about a year or so to help companies and teams get their build infrastructure set up to run better DevOps on macOS. I want to start by getting to know who's in the room a little bit. Raise your hand if you're a developer. Presumably that's a lot of you. Okay, keep your hand up if you have a DevOps team at your company that you work with. Okay, that's still most of you, which is great. Any DevOps engineers in the audience? Cool. So this is going to be a review for many of you, but I'll get through it quickly. This is the CICD process. You're probably familiar with this. The idea is to build frequently every time you commit code, run tests, get that out to users as quickly as possible, and feed it back through. Continuous deployment or continuous delivery is actually very tricky in the mobile world, so we're going to skip that part, and we're just going to focus on continuous integration for today. So this is the build and the test part of the process. So you build on every commit, you test on every build. It helps you find errors faster and get to value sooner. This works in a particular way almost everywhere else, right? You commit your code. That kicks off the CI orchestration tool to actually spin up some infrastructure at your cloud provider of choice. You use your DevOps tools to go provision that, make sure that it's all loaded with the right dependencies, and then run your build. Apple world works a little bit differently. So Xcode is required for all of your iOS and macOS builds. macOS is required for Xcode. Mac is required for macOS. And there is no public cloud for macOS. So Apple is really helping us all build different. So what are your options? There's a lot of great CI as a service tools. Got them listed here: Bitrise, BuddyBuild, Circle, App Center, Travis, and they all work really, really well. In fact, a little secret is a lot of these companies use MacStadium's infrastructure for their macOS hardware on the back end. If you're not using a CI as a service tool and you're not using MacStadium, then you are DIYing Mac servers in piles, under the desk, in the closet. How many people have something like this in their office? Okay, let the record show most hands. And this can work well too. If you just have a couple of Macs, that's fine. If you have a small team and you don't need that much infrastructure. I can tell you from personal experience, if you start getting in the order of 15, 20, 40 of these, those towers get wobbly. We have heard of engineers who have kind of gone crazy with an erector set or a Home Depot and gotten this stuff mounted in racks, and that can work too. Let me talk to you about some of the reasons why you might not want to do this. So the CI as a service tools work great. If you need to configure your build machines to meet some kind of special requirement, for example, if you want your builds to go faster and you want more resource per build machine, you're out of luck. Security is up there. These services are typically very secure. However, your security team may not be that excited about you sending proprietary code to a cloud provider that they don't have the opportunity to vet and lock down. If you're at a smaller company, you might be able to get away with it. A lot of larger companies have trouble with this. On the DIY side of things, the main issue is scalability. You're just not going to have a good time managing that many Macs. You're going to spend a lot of time maintaining them, running patches, updates, re-imaging Mac Minis. If it's not your job to waste an afternoon once a month doing this, it's somebody's job, and that's not really a great way to do things. Also, when you're running those bare metal hosts, automation becomes a big problem. You're typically clicking mouses and plugging wires in more than you want to. So we've got about 10 more minutes, and I want to share some insights that we have from working with awesome companies. We work with big tech companies. We work with fast-growing startups. We work with big enterprises that are super concerned about security. We work with people who are doing very complex macOS builds. And we work with a lot of the CI tools and providers that we all rely on. So there are 4 big challenges when we're talking about Mac CI setups. There's probably a lot more than that, but we're going to talk about 4 because we've got a short amount of time, and happy to go over anything else if you guys have questions afterwards. Deploying the hardware, virtualizing it, then speeding up the builds, and making sure that the whole thing remains secure and compliant. So deploying Mac hardware, we talked about this a little bit. We've seen a lot of people do it in a lot of different ways. I have yet to meet somebody who likes the way that they did it, which is why you should use MacStadium. We take Apple's consumer hardware, and we turn it into enterprise-grade Mac infrastructure. We can deploy it in top-tier data centers. We upgrade it with super fast 10 gigabit Ethernet, redundant power, fiber channel, and we can make sure that it's deployed along with firewalls, storage, and 24/7 remote hands. If you haven't been by our table outside, come take a look. At AltConf 2018, we're announcing our iMac Pro offering. So this is, as Tim called it, the most powerful Mac ever made, and it's a hell of a lot of compute. Our proprietary racks here allow us to get 24 iMac Pros in a rack, which is just tremendous. And I'll show you some of the benchmarking that we've done a little bit later, but these things run screaming fast builds. If you're interested, that's the sign up for our private beta. Okay, problem number 2 is virtualizing macOS on the hardware once you get it running. First question you might ask is why? So we talked before about maintenance. Once you set up a VM template, you do that once, you maintain that one template, and you can scale that across all of your build machines. So you're not updating 25 Mac minis, you're updating one template and then running that across your entire infrastructure. You also get much more reliable builds. Once you start virtualizing, you can do ephemeral builds, which means every time you kick off a build job, commit your code, you're going to create a VM just for that build. That means that every build is the same. Your builds don't fail randomly, and you eliminate the problem of, hey, it worked on my machine, it's not my problem. Next thing is multiple configs. You may have different VM templates for your release candidates, for your internal debugs, for your test machines, and even for the side project you're working on. You can maintain those different VM templates and use them for the use case that they're needed for, which means that any piece of your infrastructure can be the right build machine for what you're doing at that time. And then the last is around scalability and automation. Once you solve this for 2 VMs, it works just the same for 20 and 2000. So as your team grows, as your needs grow, as your builds become more complex, as you build in more test automation to prevent tech debt, it scales right along with you. And of course, it lets you manage the whole thing as code because now you can automate this with APIs and command line interfaces. So we agree that it's a good idea. Now we're talking about what tool do we want to use to manage it. VMware is something that's been around forever. It's very well established. It's super scalable. It's flexible. It can do almost anything. It's also pretty complex to use. There are APIs, but people don't tend to love them. The other option is something that is actually pretty new. There's a company called Virtu. It's based out here in the Valley, and they just recently went GA with Anka, which is their macOS virtualization technology. It actually runs on Mac. It's built for Mac, and it's built with CI use cases in mind. Also at AltConf 2018, we're announcing a partnership with Anka. So you can now come to MacStadium and get Anka-powered clouds ready to go. There's the URL if you want to sign up for the private beta for that. So both of these are great options, and depending on your use case, depending on your need, depending on what you're doing at your company, the expertise of your team, one may be better than the other. That's another place where MacStadium can help. We have a lot of experience with both of these. We can help you work through the ins and outs of getting them set up. And so if you're curious about which one might be better, feel free to have a chat with us. Okay, so once you have the infrastructure up and running, the first thing people want to do is speed up their builds. It's pretty simple. Once you have the virtualization environment set up, there are plugins that make it pretty easy to connect to the orchestration tool of choice, whether you're using Jenkins or BuildKite or something else. Speeding up the builds is obviously a top priority. It's probably why you moved off of your CI as a service platform in the first place. So one thing you can do is refactor your code. Spend weeks and weeks making explicit everything that was implicit. Maybe moving to a different programming language. That's terrible. It takes a lot of work. There's a few other tricks which I can share here. So one is to parallelize your tests. Once you're on scalable, virtualized infrastructure, you can take your test phase of your build of your CI process and actually parallelize that across a bunch of different machines. So instead of running 10 tests on one machine sequentially, you run 10 tests on 10 machines, and it takes 1/10 of the time. So that can cut your CI process by a lot. And certain tools like BuildKite actually automate that for you really, really easily. You don't have to do much extra work. You just ask it to parallelize and give it the pointers to the VMs. You can also preload your repos into your build machines. This is a trick that some of our customers use when they have really big code repositories. They will use they'll use Packer to every hour push the entire repo into their build VM. So that build VM is almost all up to date. So once that build job kicks off, it's a really quick pull to do the diff from what it was initially loaded with, and then they're off and running. So that can also cut minutes out of your build. And the last thing is bigger builders. So this is the easiest one to do. If you're running on a Mac Mini now, and your build takes a lot of time, if you up that to either a bigger machine or a bigger VM, you can go a lot faster. So I'm going to share some benchmarking that we've done. And we've got a lot of detail on this, but this is a short talk. So if you're interested, hit me up and we can give you a lot of information. This is to run the Swift compiler, to run a build, and this is on bare metal machines. So a 2-core Mac Mini will take 100 minutes. And if you run that on an 18-core iMac Pro, it's going to take you 13 minutes. So it's a 7-8x speed up just by running it on a different piece of hardware. Now, one thing that we've noticed is that the build times can change quite a bit based on the code base that you're using, the language that you're using, the size of the VMs that you're using, and the type of machine. So your mileage will vary. What we typically see is that customers will run a few different tests to find the point where their price performance is the best. You also may not need a 13-minute build if it's going to cost you 10 times as much. You may want to actually settle for a 20-minute build and pay a lot less for it. The last thing I wanted to talk about is security and compliance. Security is, of course, extremely important, more important than ever. I'll talk about Apple's EULA real quick here because it's relevant. They say two things about running macOS in a virtualized way, that you have to run your macOS on genuine Apple hardware, which is why we exist, and you have to run macOS on hardware that you own or control. So this is why we don't provision a public cloud where you can buy a VM and scale up like EC2. We wish we could, but it's not allowed. So what we do is we deploy private clouds. So all the hardware is dedicated to each customer. And it's actually a pretty useful tool because security teams love this. It gives you root access to every piece of the infrastructure, and you can control the firewall, you can control the hosts and the storage. We can add all kinds of bells and whistles that make it even more secure so that we actually don't really have a lot of problems passing security audits, which is useful if what you want is to get infrastructure so that you can start running better builds and not get bogged down in a big security tangle. We're also ISO 27001 and 2 certified, so that helps as well. So there you have it. Simple, scalable, supported by expertise, super secure, and helps with performance. So I think we're almost out of time, but if there are any questions, I'm happy to answer them. Yeah, so also in the EULA, Apple talks about limiting the number of VMs per host, and they say that you should only run 2 VMs per host. That's something that we leave to our customers, so we don't track it or really have any ability to inspect it. Some customers are very careful and just run 2, and some run more. Anything else? Yeah.
Sorry. Continuous integration services tend to be expensive, especially if you're using something like Buddy Build or stuff like that. If you're buying a lot of build time, it's very expensive. So how do you guys, how do you charge people, or what's the pricing tiers, a ballpark figure?
Yeah, so you can look on our website for some introductory pricing, and then those are for relatively small environments, and that scales up to, thousands and thousands of hosts for some of our biggest customers. The way that we price, though, is based on the actual hardware. So because we're doing dedicated clouds, you're paying for the machines that you're using, and you're paying for them 100% of the time. So like you said, if you're using sort of a consumption-based model and you're consuming a lot, it's actually cheaper to have dedicated hardware. If you're just running one build a week or one build a day, then yeah, it's probably cheaper to use a buddy build or to put the Mac Mini under your desk. So I think we should probably wrap it up there, but my email address is up here. You can find a lot of more information at macstadium.com, and we're set up right outside. So if you guys want to stop by and take a look at the iMac Pros or ask us any other questions, please do. Thank you guys very much.